You're killing me. All right, let me get back in here and share my screen so you can see it. That would be a good idea. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Now we're sharing the screen, right?
Yeah.
Woohoo! All right. So here's the map that I just went through. I hope the map is a little bit more obvious now. We can see it. Again, with the House of Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo people in Nigeria. All right, this is again an older graphic, but it's still relevant in terms of the Islamic fundamentalist group Boko Haram. They've existed in Nigeria for about 20 years at this point. If you notice here, these darker green areas, okay, they are the areas where the states have been most affected by Boko Haram. The government has had to fight back against Boko Haram because they are designated as a terrorist group. They seek to impose Sharia law through force. And just to be clear, folks, this is Sunni Sharia law, not Shia Sharia law in the case of, say, Iran. But there have been, over the last 10 years, major struggles in these areas with the government being sometimes more, sometimes less successful in suppressing these terrorist actions, frequently which involve kidnapping of young girls from local areas and forced marriages, as well as physical attacks that women have experienced. The entire area of the north can have Sharia law if the local areas agree. So if there's a local agreement, say in a village, to establish Sharia law, but only in applying to people who are observant Muslims, and that it is a parallel setup from the judicial system. In other words, you have an independent judiciary for the most part at this point in Nigeria, but on the local level, there are villages and towns that have Sharia law. And in the view of Boko Haram, and also in the eyes of some more observantly Muslim groups inside of the northern Nigerian states, the integration of Sharia with government actions and laws hasn't gone far enough. So there have been clashes with the local states and villages and towns with the national government and also internationally. Here again is another graphic so that you can see the violence of Boko Haram. Again, this is a slightly dated graphic because it dates to 2013. However, the same violence in the same areas has continued for a decade at this point, and waxed and waned. But like, this is absolutely the type of thing that's going to show up on the exam in terms of this isn't just a separatist group. Like this is a group of people actively engaged in trying to overthrow areas of governance and establish a legitimacy based on Sharia. So many Nigerians do live below what is considered the poverty line in many other countries. There is a large gap between the rich and the poor. However, you might have, I don't know if it showed up on the slide if you saw it earlier, but to repeat, Nigeria has the largest economy at this point in Africa. It's the largest economy. It's surpassed rather South Africa. And what that means is that unfortunately, the gap between the very wealthy and the very poor has actually been, or is initially rather, exacerbated, but the government has had to take action to address those wealth gaps, and sometimes has been ineffective in doing so. I'm going to pause for just a second while I have some coffee. An additional issue and challenge in Nigeria, obviously the challenge of COVID most recently for its healthcare system, which does not have the infrastructure of any of the countries that we've talked about, but also HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS in West African countries has been a big healthcare struggle for over 30 years. It is one that Western European nations and the United States have tried to work with the Nigerian government to provide medical support. However, access to proper testing, care, and treatment for HIV has been something that Nigeria struggled with. Low literacy rates when compared to the other big six. In fact, the literacy rates are the lowest among the AP big six countries. Here's a graphic, again, slightly dated, but in all honesty, folks, it has not changed significantly in terms of the rates of HIV infections. As you can see, they're really fairly high to have. At this point, I believe we're over 5 million people living with HIV in Nigeria. That's a really significant healthcare challenge. Okay, so again, vast number of different ethnic groups. I get 3 ethnic groups that are dominant. The Hausa, that's spelled wrong. It should be Hausa. Hausa, Fulani, the Igbo, and Yoruba. We speak completely different languages, completely different linguistic history and background. We also have religious cleavages. There are regional cleavages, north versus south, urban versus rural. There are only Lagos, which is in southwestern Nigeria, and Abuja, the capital, are heavily urbanized, but large portions of Nigeria are not urbanized at all. We also have, again, this wealth gap where there are elites who have access to Nigeria's resources, who maintain their power by appealing to specific ethnic and religious groups, and then creating coalitions and suppressing opposition. This is to give you an idea of wealth distribution. Okay. Relatively wealthy is the lighter pink to very dark purple. And what you can hopefully see is that there's a trend where in far western to central, and then the central northern parts of Nigeria, there is increased poverty. But what really is important is here, in the areas where Boko Haram is most active, these states also have very high concentrations of poverty. Again, northern states do have the option, especially at the local level, of adopting Sharia law. It's not one that all states and all localities take. Okay, so here we go with the government structures. And I'm gonna zip through this because we kind of talked about this already. But here's the kind of presidential timeline. We have a presidential model. So the parliamentary model that I mentioned is followed into 1979, like I said before. But there was the issue, and again, this is like kind of a prime example, folks, of if you're asked on a concept comparison or even an argument-based essay evaluating the parliamentary system is the best approach for governance. Here's a prime example of a parliamentary system that did not work. When you have severe and significant ethnic cleavages, it allows the formation of coalitions, for example, like the Hausa Fulani and the Igbo in Nigeria, to suppress opposition and control parliament. So the shift took place to a federalist system. And what you have is up into 1993, or rather in 1983, there is a military dictatorship that gets established through a coup d'etat. All right. If you have to give an example or identify an example of revolution versus coup d'etat, so coup d'etat, removing the leadership of a regime, revolution. So if we remove the leadership of regime, we might actually not change the regime. We might see some changes in government. In a revolution, we will see a change in regime and a possibly in every other example that we have, whether it's Russia, Mexico, or China, Nigeria is another one, will have a complete change in government as well. Buhari is removed by Babangida in 1985. Babangida is then removed by General Abacha in 1993. We get civilian rule finally reestablished in 1999 and a peaceful transition of power where President Obasanjo is elected. I don't think you'll necessarily see names, but it's just important for you to know that we have an election of a president who observes a two-term limit. So we actually get constitutional principles, we get rule of law being followed. And in 2007, President Goodluck Jonathan is elected to a two-term limit that is then observed. In 2015, Muhammadu Buhari, former general leader who said staged this military coup, Muhammadu Buhari is elected president in 2015, and I have to do math very quickly in my head. There hasn't been a second election. There will be, the next election is in 2023. The other thing that I'll point out is that, just as an example of overcoming ethnic cleavages and religious cleavages, Goodluck Jonathan is Christian, identifies as Christian, and Muhammadu Buhari identifies as Muslim. But both of them needed to gain the support of large numbers with the presidential approach of elections of, again, 2/3 of this. You have to win 2/3 of the Nigerian states, at least 25% of the vote. And if no one gets that plus a majority, we have a runoff election. That means that Goodluck Jonathan and Muhammadu Buhari were able to gain support in both the North and the South, as well as from people who did not identify as Christian or Muslim. You get a little timeline so that you can see kind of the back and forth between a republic, military rule, a republic, military rule, a republic, military rule, and a republic. Okay. And also, here's like just a quick example of where the leaders are from during this time period, whether it's the South, the far North, or again, the South closer to the Niger River Delta. I'm going to skip that. Skip this as well, because this is, folks, this is standard authoritarianism. Presidents under Buhari up through 85, and Babangida and Abacha appointed senior officials without legislative approval, sometimes overrode legislatures completely or dismissed legislatures. There were little to no checks placed on presidential power. We do not have an independent judiciary. Again, patron-client system where the presidents were able to stay in power through exploiting both prebendal kinship networks as well as exploiting resources. And again, you might see it come up on the exam as the resource curse. The idea that having these additional resources, especially oil, is a challenge that governments continue to have to wrestle with again and again. did this already. I did want to connect you with the concept of parastatals. Parastatals, uh, I don't know if it'll come up on the exam, folks, but parastatals are simply corporatist structures. Um, Corporatism being a system of linkage institutions that connect corporations and businesses very closely with the government, to the point where the government sometimes actually controls the corporations themselves. Okay. So parastatals can be defined as an organization, an industry. It's especially true of the oil industry. In countries like Nigeria and Iran, having political authority and serving the needs of the state. They get money from the state, and they also provide support or favors through a patronage network. Mexico, this has to do with Pemex. In Iran, it's the Bonyads. If you were in class when we covered a question about Iran and the Bonyads, this is just the term for the Iranian parastatals that are extended charities that also are connected to oil, and all led by religious leaders who are appointed by the Ayatollah. So this is, again, patronage. Britain, Quangos, don't stress about those so much, but they're quasi non-governmental organizations that are parastatals. And in China, they're referred to as gongos, or governmentally organized non-governmental organizations. That sounds like it's a little strange. It is, because remember that China's Communist Party pervades everything in China, and even the parastatals, okay, these supposedly independent organizations are actually actively set up by the government and by the Chinese Communist Party. So in theory, all right, the entities like oil production in Nigeria, or electricity production, or providing water in Nigeria would be privately owned, but instead it's government ministries that appoint the leadership of these corporations, and then the corporate leadership is kind of interwoven with the government. So this is very much like Nigeria, is very much like Mexico prior to the 1980s. Again, where corporations are owned by the state, provide commercial and social welfare services like water, electricity, public transportation, agricultural subsidies, controlling industries like steel and oil. Again, here we go with another parallel, all right, that this is similar to, again, Mexico prior to democratization. All right, corporatism is important, folks. State corporatism is what we have in China. But one of the reasons that corporatism exists and continues, it actually supports an authoritarian political system, because the government gets the input from these wealthy elites connected to the corporations, and then serves their needs. And then stays in power. If you want, like, bing, bang, bang, another connection, that would be Russia currently with the oligarchs, okay? And that we just don't have neo-corporatism, but with Rosneft and Gazprom, and the patronage connected to those that are dominated by oligarchs, Putin's engaged in kind of going back to corporatism that Yeltsin had tried to break up with shock therapy, okay? Corporatism in Mexico, again, in parallel to Iran, all right? We had the PRI, or pre-dominated Mexico, where Pemex was part of this process. In Iran, the Bonyads do this, okay? If you see the term parastatal, it is a linkage institution where there is some political authority and it serves the state indirectly, but it connects corporate entities and the state through funding and patronage. So there's one parastatal that President Obasanjo established. It has been since dissolved, as far as I know, but it was NEPA, the Nigerian Energy Power Administration. But they kind of, the running joke in Nigeria that was never expect power again. It was renamed the Power Holding Company, and then that meant please hold candle. So like rolling electricity outages, brownouts, and a lack of infrastructure are kind of endemic in Nigeria even now. There have been attempts to resolve this, but again, this is, the details of this conflict aren't so important as it is the fact that every time we try to resolve the conflict of corruption and corporatism in Nigeria, we get the uncovering of a scandal and the use of power for personal gain. Already ran through this again. This is just to repeat it. All right. The fact that we have a parliamentary system that shifts to a presidential system, parliamentary unicameral, presidential system, bicameral, and federal structure. Okay. Let's talk about the legislative branch. We get an upper and lower house. This looks just like the United States. This looks just like Mexico. The structure is just like Russia as well. Okay. In Nigeria, 109 senators directly elected from each of the 36 states. Okay. And then one senator from the capital territory of Abuja. Popular vote. This is a plurality-based system. You don't need to get a majority to get into the Senate. So because the representation model is based on the US Senate, in other words, we have geographic areas that are set up as states. Not all those geographic areas have the same population, so some senators might have smaller constituencies than others. But the ethnic and religious diversity of Nigeria is reflected in the Senate. This is, I wrote this on a smartboard at one point in time when it was 30%. I believe, again, now we're up to 40% in some of the political parties like PRI. Okay, here's, again, important information that's similar to Mexico. All right, representatives in the House of Representatives in Nigeria are elected by plurality, not majority. Okay, wide array of different ethnic groups in the House of Representatives, but really super important contrast is the very, very low political inclusion of women in Nigeria. Nigeria women have been fighting to get increased political support and get elected to office for decades, and the success rate has been really low. All right, so the judiciary, immediately after independence, lots of autonomy. We get this mix of British common law and then Sharia law. Things seem to be fairly objective, but with the dominance of parliament and the coalitions that shut out opposition, the objectivity of the judicial system and rule of law really benefited the people who were in power and the parties that held on to power. Until 1999, the judiciary was heavily, heavily damaged by military rule. And the long-term effect of that is that, and this has decreased in the last 10 years, but the long-term impact was that for a long time, judges in the system, in the judicial system, did not necessarily have in-depth legal training and might pass down decisions that are manipulated by the government or by special interest groups, parastatals, or wealthy individuals. We do have judicial review, okay? On paper, just like Russia, in the Constitution, just like Mexico, all right? Mexico, at this point, we've got very well-established judicial review. In Russia, with the Constitutional Court, and make sure it's not the Supreme Court in Russia, it's the Constitutional Court, very weak judicial review. In Nigeria, there's a Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, a court system just like the United States in terms of structure. Again, 12 of the Muslim states in the north do have Sharia courts. They do have courts that have implemented Sharia law fully. And then there are areas, so that's criminal law. And then there are areas that have Sharia law that's civil only. An example of how this is played out, and again, this example, if you get into this level of specificity on the exam, it would be in the arguments-based response, but this has to do with the rights of women in Nigeria. We parallel this to the rights of women in Iran in terms of there being different punishments for something like adultery that women experience, where it's much more harsh than for men. In 2002, so 20 years ago, but it still has come up in Nigeria. Safiya Hussaini was accused of adultery, having had a child with a married man, even though she was divorced. She was sentenced to death by stoning. There was an appeal, there was international opposition. There's a great deal of attention placed on Nigeria as a result of this. The decision was rescinded, okay? This happened again a few years later, in 2003, it's happened in 2011. But women securing equal rights and not having human rights violated has been something that, particularly in the northern part of Nigeria, has been a struggle that women have faced. Again, I mentioned earlier the kidnappings that young women under the age of 18 have experienced with the terrorist group Boko Haram. Again, another challenge facing women in Nigeria. Okay, this just summarized everything that I went through earlier, most of which you've heard, but didn't get to see the map. Okay, I've included this so that it's there in additional spots as well. There's the map again. Okay, I have written down the similarities of the ethnic cleavages to Chechnya. The one difference, I guess, with China in terms of ethnic divisions is that Xinjiang and Tibet are both far away from the center of power in Beijing. But Chechnya, Biafra, we've got parallels there, and I would, again, suggest the additional third parallel of the troubles in Northern Ireland. That's repeated. I've got that repeated. This is me being very, very efficient. I just want to show you very quickly how things change over time. So this is where we have a parliamentary system starting in the 60s. Watch what happens to the number of areas as time goes on into 1991. This means federal central territory, by the way. And we're getting more states. And here we get up to now, okay? Again, notice the size difference, but there's also a population difference with the northern territories or northern states having a lower population. Okay, this is, you might see the activist groups MOSOP, M-O-S-O-P, and MEND. I'll give you the notes for them in a moment. But mend the movement for the emancipation of the Niger River Delta. And it's the movement for the emancipation of the Niger River Delta, which was organized largely by an environmental activist, Ken Sawa-Wiwa. I believe I mentioned this in class when we were going through some multiple choice questions. That activism and pushing back against really what were Western interventions in the oil production economy because of environmental damage were Sawa-Wiwa was assassinated. Activism has been brutally suppressed, and this has come out over time, especially in post 2010, of these corporations' involvement in both the environmental damage, but in the manipulation of the government, and pressure has been placed on the government, and protests have happened to get the government to renationalize its oil industry. Do this again. You might get, I don't think you would necessarily see a map like this, but it's just so that you can see how the areas where there's increased poverty align with monocultural or single crop production, like peanuts, for example, or cotton. Whereas in the South, we have palm oil, cocoa. We've got a diversity of agricultural products in addition to industrial production. So the South is more industrialized and more diversified economically. This is a repeat. I don't stress this too much in terms of centripetal versus centrifugal forces. I don't think you're going to see that on the exam. You've got a lot of skepticism of the government. Despite that, okay, democracy is viewed both in Nigeria and throughout Southwestern African countries as being the desired form of government. This has been the case since 2006, so for 15 years now. This has not changed, folks, in terms of the corruption perception index, okay, with the exception of Russia going up in the corruption perception index. Remember, folks, that the corruption perception index, if you see it come up, the higher the number, the lower the corruption. Okay, so the idea is the more, so 74, you think of this in terms of percentages, in terms of a score, 74% of people in Great Britain are going to say that the government is not corrupt versus only 27% of people saying that the government is not corrupt in Nigeria. You might see the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index, come up similarly to the Human Development Index, the HDI, or the Gini coefficient, which we've talked about in class as well. They're in your notes that I provided to you, so you can check those out and let me know if you have any questions. Again, rentier state, you get rent seeking. I'm just giving you these additional definitions so that you've got them. The political parties, you want to make sure these are that you have these. We have the People's Democratic Party and the Congress for Progressive Change. Folks, the question that comes up on the exam is federal systems tending to lead to a two-party dominance. This, or even in the case of Russia, single-party dominance. This would be your example, is Nigeria. Whereas in Mexico, the contrasting examples, we have a federal system that has set up, say, for example, with the election of the legislative branch that involves proportional representation, not just direct election. The direct election trends toward two-party dominance because you always need that highest percentage, first past the post. in order for your party's candidate to win, versus Mexico, where it's a plurality system and we have proportional representation, which increases the likelihood of creating a more party balance. But this is just so that you can see kind of color coded the party affiliations and how we are diverse, but we end up still electing. So these are remember the 25% rule. These are the areas in the north that are Muslim that are voting for a Christian candidate with good luck, Jonathan. Okay. And that is it. I'm going to minimize here. And if I can, bring things up. Folks, do we have questions? Anything